Tens of millions of dead bodies, more than 50 countries involved, millions of homes destroyed, an industrial sector shattered. The results of World War II were absolutely devastating, especially for old Europe. Many young workers died, others were injured, infrastructure was destroyed, clothing, food and fuel were in short supply, and countries such as the United Kingdom were even forced to impose the use of ration cards. Let's be clear, the war left Europe's economic prospects badly damaged. After the conflict, the old continent risked being condemned to poverty, so it had to repair the damage of the conflict before it was too late. Reconstruction had to begin as a matter of urgency, and it was just at that moment when one of the most important men in recent European history appeared on the scene. A man who changed everything, George Marshall. George Marshall was the US Army general in charge of organizing the victory over the Nazis. His achievements in battle were recognized by Winston Churchill himself, and although the history books will keep his military milestones in the war episodes, his name will undoubtedly be remembered for a totally different reason: the Marshall Plan. You see, after the war ended, General Marshall led a huge aid plan with the goal of rebuilding Europe. The US spent lots and lots of money to help the old continent rise from the ashes. And here, we're not talking about allied countries such as France or the United Kingdom. The Marshall Plan also greatly helped countries that had been enemies until then, such as Germany and Italy. The aim of this plan was for Europe to grow together in the decades to come, and to do so, it had to rely on each and every one of its member nations. Now, what exactly did this extensive Marshall Plan consist of? Because, as we've said, Europeans were starving and destitute. Almost all their productive capacity had turned to ashes. So the most urgent matters were, first, to cover the most essential needs of health and food, and second, to revive European industry. To achieve this, the US sent money, food and fuel, and building materials. And not only that, it also sent dozens of American engineers with the aim of updating and improving European technology. The question is, did all this aid work to lift Europe out of misery? Well, at first glance, yeah, the plan was a success. Since the Marshall Plan, countries such as France began to grow at a much faster rate than even the pre-World War I trend. During the plan, European GDP grew by 32%, agricultural production returned to pre-war levels, and industrial production rebounded by another 40%, exceeding all forecasts. To give you an idea, every dollar received by the Marshall Plan boosted investment by 40 cents. Not bad. And yet, how would you feel if I told you that the Marshall Plan might have been a great farce? What if I told you that, according to some experts, this plan had nothing to do with European success following the Second World War? Do you want to know why? Well, today on Visualeconomik, we'll tell you all about it. One thing is clear. If the Marshall Plan was indeed what boosted the European economy after the war, it would be reasonable to expect that the countries that received the most aid would also be the ones that grew the most, wouldn't it? Yeah, that would be the logical result. However, as you can see in this graph, there is no clear relationship between the aid received by each country and its subsequent level of economic growth. Countries such as Norway, France, and Italy received more aid than Germany, but grew much less than the German economy. As if this were not enough, another thing to bear in mind is that, in reality, European economic growth began long before the Marshall Plan aid arrived. For example, of the 13,000 kilometers of roadways that were mostly destroyed during the war in West Germany, 12,000 kilometers were in full operation by 1946, 2 years before the Marshall Plan. But we said earlier that every dollar of aid boosted investment by 40 cents, so didn't that help stabilize the economy and contain inflation? Well, yes, but in aggregate terms, that momentum was really very, very small. To give you an idea, the Marshall Plan's contribution to Europe's annual economic growth was between 0.05 and 0.1% of GDP for most countries. We are therefore talking about a practically insignificant influence. And so, of the 13 percentage points that the West German economy grew during that period, it's estimated that only 0.05 points were due to the Marshall Plan. Yes, that's right, 0.05 out of 13. An absolutely negligible effect. So does all this mean that the Marshall Plan was an absolute failure? That it had nothing to do with the recovery from the war or the stellar economic growth that would follow? Well, once again, let's not go too fast, because beyond purely statistical matters, there's another factor to take into account. You see, following the end of the war, European economies were loaded with many state-owned companies. Let's say that for some decades up until that point, the role of private companies had been pushed to the background in the old continent. The influence of states on production was increasingly greater. And why was that a problem, you may ask? Well, basically, because many of these state-owned companies performed very, very poorly, and therefore, as was the case with many market-unfriendly or strict regulations, they held Europe's economies back from reaching their full potential. The question is, what does all this have to do with the Marshall Plan? Well, according to Brand DeLong and Barry Eichengreen, two of the foremost authorities on the subject, the Marshall Plan was instrumental in driving significant political liberalization in Europe. On the one hand, the plan's economic aid served to satisfy workers and prevent the growth of populist discourse. This allowed, for instance, both governments and businessmen to make relatively unpopular adjustment plans such as tax cuts and tax increases, which were nevertheless essential for avoiding long-term problems. On the other hand, the aid also served to satisfy some business lobbies that would otherwise have tried to manipulate the political power to obtain profits at the expense of the population. Let's just say that with the Marshall Plan aid, they were satisfied. And not only that, at the same time, the aid also allowed companies to increase their profits. With these higher profits, they were able to invest more. And thus, although the investment boom did not come from direct aid to set up the factories, it was indirectly stimulated by the Marshall Plan. But be that as it may, if there was one reason why this plan was a success beyond the statistics, it is that of European cohesion. Let's remember that above all, what the plan was intended to achieve was to build a united Europe, where grudges and frictions would be left behind. In that sense, we could say that the Marshall Plan was not a great success because of its direct impact, but rather because of all that it entailed at the political and social level. Of course, knowing this, there are a few questions we can ask. Could plans like this be applied in other countries that are having problems to boost their growth? Countries such as Latin America or Africa. Would it be worthwhile? Could a similar plan even be applied in Ukraine after the war? Well, let's take a look.
One plan to enrich them all?
Visualeconomik community, the Marshall Plan is today much more than an economic program of 70 years ago. It's practically a symbol. I'm sure you have heard some politician or talk show host urgently call for a new Marshall Plan for some part of the world. In a way, today it's almost always used to refer to a very large foreign aid program. In fact, it's not uncommon to come across news like this.
German minister urges African Marshall Plan. Boris Johnson eyes world stage with the Marshall Plan for Ukraine.
Now, let's remember what we have just said. The Marshall Plan did not boost Europe's growth because the aid improved the economy, but because it made it easier for Europe to make good decisions, good policies that ended up shaping its institutions. And yes, I know that sometimes the world of economics is a bit tiresome when it comes to talking about institutions. They almost seem like a catch-all with a somewhat diffuse meaning, institutions. But the truth is that they are the key to encouraging growth. The existence of mechanisms that prevent governments from being corrupted or persecuting business people, that guarantee that there are no privileges for just a few, that help the justice system to function in a timely manner, or that prevent regulations and taxes from suffocating. All are key for the future of states. And in that respect, helping a state to equip itself with these institutions can be much more important and effective than just throwing them money. Hence, reasoning such as the following.
$568 billion in African aid and little to show for it. A growing chorus of Africans is saying what they really need is not to rely on handouts, but to rebuild on their own with investment.
If you are loyal followers of Visualeconomik, you will know that we have talked about this topic in lots of videos. Be that as it may, one thing is clear. Sending aid left, right, and center is all very well to solve a humanitarian catastrophe, such as an earthquake or an epidemic, but doesn't bring about structural changes in the country. What's more, there is a case that is perhaps more interesting than the aid sent to Africa, what many people call the Soviet Marshall Plan, the famous ComicCon. ComicCon was a program promoted by Joseph Stalin, a program that was conceived with the objective of strengthening ties between the countries of the socialist bloc and as a direct response to the American Marshall Plan. The countries that received this aid, such as Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Mongolia, Cuba, and Vietnam, did see some very important statistics improve, such as literacy rates and life expectancy. Even so, all these countries lagged far behind the Western Bloc. And why did they lag behind? Indeed, because of their model of political, economic, and social organization. By accepting Soviet aid, these countries were obliged to make reforms to bring their economies closer to the socialist model of the Soviet Union. The different governments began to nationalize enterprises, to collectivize agriculture, and to reduce trade with the capitalist bloc. And naturally, all that was a terrible idea, but you already know that. The fact is that, once again, each country's institutions are much more important than international aid. Now, does this mean that no program like the Marshall Plan can ever work again? Well, obviously not. What's more, there is a case that seems almost textbook, a case where such a program could be a lifesaver. Of course, we're talking about Ukraine. Ukraine is a country that has been oscillating between the Western orbit and the Russian orbit over recent decades. However, the war with Russia has definitely changed everything. Now, Ukraine has clearly chosen sides. We don't know how the war will end, but what we do know is that the country will need a lot of help to get back on its feet, and also that it will have to make some very fundamental social and economic reforms. Fortunately, the government seems to be willing to do so. In fact, they almost seem to be the most enthusiastic about the idea of westernizing. In this context, robust international aid could strengthen the government's position in regards to the very numerous oligarchs who still exist and who, not surprisingly, are much more comfortable with the old system. Well, according to a World Bank estimate, a new Marshall Plan for Ukraine would cost about $540 billion, 3 times more than the original Marshall Plan. This time, however, it would not be just one country putting up the money. In its day, the Marshall Plan cost almost 3% of US GDP, but the $540 billion for Ukraine would be just under 0.02% of the GDP of the US and Europe combined. But at this point, it's your turn. What did you think of the Marshall Plan before watching this video? Do you think it was really that important to protect European institutions? Will we see a Marshall Plan in Ukraine? You can leave us your answers in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visual Economic, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already. All the best, and see you next time.